Good afternoon, everyone. I am Lisa Stutz, the museum director. And on behalf of the museum and the Friends of the Museum, I want to thank all of you for coming to our annual National Day of the American Cowboy program. But before I introduce our presenters for today, I want to ask everyone to please silence their cell phones. And if you have any questions that come up during the presentation, if you can wait until the end of the program to ask our presenters. And following the program, the Friends will be offering up some light refreshments in our program room, our normal program room, on the other side of the building. Before I make introductions, of course, there's a few other quick announcements about upcoming programs that we'll be doing. The museum will be hosting a community coffee and conversation this coming Wednesday at 9 a.m. The topic of the conversation will be memorable storms. And of course, we'll be serving free coffee and donuts. And next Saturday, July 29th at 10 a.m., we will have part 2 of our historic walking tour of downtown. The tour is free and registration for that is available online via our website. Our 2 fabulous presenters for our annual program today, Shari Mohr and Hildebrand, both serve on the board of the Western Fremont County Historical Society and are members of our Friends group. For the past year or so, right? You guys have been working tirelessly on researching the many ranches and cattlemen of this vast region. Gathering up all photos, information, dirt that you can find on them. And I know you've used our facility to help you with the research. And knowing all of that hard work that you put in there, I wanted to invite them specifically to present all their findings for this annual event, mainly because shamelessly, I wanted to know what they found. And I figured that there was more than just me that was very interested in what they wanted to learn, or what they've learned. With that, I will turn it now over to Shari and Deb, and thank you profusely for accepting this invitation to do our program.
Well, thanks, Lisa. We want to give a thanks to everyone that helped us along the way, but one of the things is the reasons why we did this research on cattlemen, cattle ranches, and cowboys was to help us with future programs. And in those future programs, we realized that it became a passionate mission what we were doing. We were enjoying it so much doing it. And with that, we spent more than the last year putting this all together. But we would first like to thank Lisa and her staff for all of the documents and photos that they were able to provide us for our research. And also to Joan Larson, who taught us how to use the BLM website and to look up homestead plats. And in those homestead plats was a big portion of our research. And also, I want to point out to Brandon for all the help that we were having a problem with a PowerPoint presentation, and we went to Brandon, and Brandon was the one who helped us with that. And then most of all, a big thank you to our families, such as Tony, which is Shari's husband, had to witness all the stuff we had on their dining room table, and they had to remove it all the time.
Day after day.
And then my family, what they got to put up with was watching my desk in the area, that as I got more files, I got more bins. And these bins became encircling me, which I had to laugh when I was talking about it, that it was like being circled by a wagon train. So I just want to thank them for all what they had to put up with us while we did this research. So of this group, first of all, thank you all profusely for coming to listen to a couple of first-timers up here. But how many of you have been involved in agriculture in some way, current or past? So we have quite a few. And how many of you live here in Fremont County? All of you. So have any of you lived down in Chaffee or Park or Custer counties at all? Okay, I'm just trying to get a feel because we do mention some spots and areas around, so just wanted to try and get a feel for that. When we first started reading the reference sources, some of them are on your brochure there, we found out that one book would list a cowboy or a cattleman 3 or 4 times. Maybe another one might have a short paragraph or even a chapter. But no one book really gave you a total view of who they were talking about or mentioning. So that became our mission, was to produce a timeline bio so you knew where they came from, what they had been doing, what their ranch was like, what their family was like, and maybe what else the ranch had done that was significant.
Well, and for me, what I would have realized when we were doing this, that all of the research with all these ranches, that we needed a family file. And what that family file included was photos, newspaper articles, or even obituaries. But what amazed us was the amount of people, while we were doing this research in all the different counties, how interested they were in what we were doing. And to the point that so many of them wanted to tell us their story on their ranch.
So we researched over 100 ranches and cowboys, and we're just highlighting a bare few of them today. And even in mentioning them is just a fraction of what we learned about them and their families. We're going to start by when they came into Colorado, so we've divided the time period into decades. At the end of our program, as Lisa said, please feel free to ask questions, but also offer any suggestions, corrections. You know, we're open to all of that. We'd like to invite you to come down to Howard, Cotopaxi, Western Fremont County, visit our History Center. We have it open periodically. We also have tours down there that I think would be exciting for you to see and attend. And we're just beginning to refurbish a former post office general store that's going to become the Cotopaxi Mullins History Center. So we'll have 2 different history centers in Western Fremont County. So we'll begin the program now, and Deb will go take the controls over there. Our first decade is going to be pre-1859. Colorado was in the Louisiana Purchase. You had Zebulon Pike, Stephen Long, and John Fremont coming to the area. You had large games of herd up in South Park, and the Utes and other tribes were still controlling that area until 1881. The earliest ranchers claimed the excellent locations of water, natural hay meadows, and they had access to immense grazing lands. Rangeland was free at that time, and this immense acreage with the water sources became known as first in time, first in right. And the first person we're going to talk about that came prior to 1859 is G.B. or Gilbert Boswell Harvey. Now, he arrived in Fremont County from West Virginia, and he had fought in the Mexican War. He had a Mexican War grant with which he could buy land. He ended up here in Canyon City in 1873. He had built several homes in Canyon City, and he's known to be a pioneer of Canyon City. He and his family
I think like brother-in-laws and extended family had actually mined in Gothic. That's up by Crested Butte, and they mined for silver up there. He eventually owned the 12-mile ranch on the Current Creek. Later, his great-grandson, James G. Harvey, acquired that same property, but they didn't even know that they had a forefather who had owned that property. We found that out in the Harvey family file. All three of GB's sons went into ranching. I'm going to kind of skip a decade here for a minute because our next person is William and John Murray, but that involves the Harvey family. William was born in Ireland, and he came here in 1873. He and his wife Rosini had two sons, William and John. William built their original home, it said, with hand-cut stones. He also built a corral and some outbuildings made out of stone. He owned the Tacklemar mine. It produced zinc, lead, and silver. He was the postmaster at Parkdale, and a Mr. Walters recalls William's fine library with law books. Mrs. Murray was described as a tiny woman. Now, she ran a boarding house and she served meals to the railroad crew, and they were warm and delicious. Now, she also had some retired Rio Grande employees who described her boarding room as being warm and cozy. Their son John married Mary Harvey, and so the Harvey family carried on William's ranch. Son John was Paul Huntley's first employer, and you'll see over here we've got Paul Huntley's saddle. They gave many of their antiques here to this museum. Well, Paul Huntley was only 14 when he began to work for John. And John Murray passed away in 1940. There was a blinding blizzard. He was at home, but he was outside and he couldn't find any shelter. He froze to death. Our next decade is 1859 to 69. Denver newspapers began advertising the availability of fresh beef. Gold was discovered in California Gulch up by Leadville. The Cattlemen had established several different operations. You had the Civil War. You also had grasshoppers destroying crops. It was estimated there were 147,000 cattle in Colorado in that year, and the first Stock Growers Association was organized in Denver. The next year, they hired detectives to curtail rustling and protect brands of members throughout the state. Now, the production of hay increased as roads improved, and the Abilene cattle market was crowded with buyers, including Colorado ranchers wanting stock for their pastures. I might mention, you'll see in bold print down here some of the names of the ranchers that came in during that decade. We now have an in-depth view of Charles and Margaret Naughtrebe over in Chaffee County at Nathrop. Now, Nathrop is halfway between Salida and Buena Vista. Right now, it just kind of looks like a little burg, but I think you'll be surprised here. Charles was of German descent. He came west with the gold rushers. We find him operating a store in Denver in 1859. And then next he was up in Leadville at California Gulch. There, in 1862, miners ran out of flour. So he enlisted the help of Henry McPherson, and they took a pack outfit clear to Taos, New Mexico. And he caught a load of flour and meal and brought it back to the miners. And we should note that Henry McPherson is the great-great-great-uncle of Dr. Wendell Hutchinson. You may have heard of the Hutchinson farm in Salida. Charles was the first person to ranch in the Chalk Creek area. That's over there by Mount Princeton, again close to Nathrop. He secured a right to the Chalk Creek water. He built a grist mill and neighbors supplied wheat, and he produced and sold Pride of the Mountain flour. Now about this time, Otto Mears was growing wheat up in Swatch. He was taking the road down to Charles' grist mill, and he had a wagon mishap. It overturned. Well, that inspired him to improve that road, and it became the toll road over Poncha Pass. Now, families of both Otto Mears and Charles Knocktree, they both claim that their relative is the one that built the road, but it seems like the researchers give Otto Mears credit for it, but no doubt they were both involved. Charles built sawmills while he was doing the ranching, running the grist mill, and also operating a store. Nathrop was named after Charles Knocktree. People couldn't pronounce his name, and so he even introduced himself as Charles Nathrop. He was involved in the Lake County War. That's a whole story in itself. His grist mill was headquarters for a vigilante committee. He married Margaret Toll Anderson. She had a daughter, Alice, and then they went ahead and had 3 children. In 1881, E.R. Emerson wrote of the Nathrop community. The town and post office are located on the plains above Chalk Creek, as well as the residence of C. Knocktree, who with 2 railway companies owns the site of the new town. He described the community as having 200 people, saloons, a newspaper, and stores. Connection at Nathrop was made with the railroads to Hortense and Alpine, and an elegant stone depot had been built by the railroad company with a large hotel convenient to the station. Well, later that year, 1881, Charles was shot in the back at his store. It seems as though it may have been over an argument over a cowboy's position on the ranch and his salary. Margaret found Charles' body at the store, but she continued to run the ranch and was much admired and respected in the community. Here's a photo, and Charles Knocktree is second from the left there. We have Earl Earhart on the left, and then we have Bailey Hutchinson, third from the left. In the back there, Bert and John Burnett, they were twins who were known to just kind of stay on the farm. The tall guy in the center there, we'll be talking about him, Tom McQuaid. Now the rest of the men were not identified, but don't they clean up well? It showed that they all got to this Denver hotel, Cattlemen's Association meeting, and they're just downright handsome over there. We next have a quick fact about Samuel Hartzell. He was born in Pennsylvania. He grew to be 6 feet tall. At age 15, he worked as a drover for the McQuaid and Powers Company in Ohio. He earned $6 per month. His job was to drive cattle from Ohio clear to New York City. The trip took about 4 months, but he walked all the way. Here's a photo of George Griffin accepting the Centennial Farm Award, but our historical fact is about Albert Griffin. Albert was on friendly terms with Chief Ouray and Sub-Chief Colero. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that name correctly. But he homesteaded with Rudd, Catlin, Draper, and Macon here in 1864. Those are all names that you're familiar with here in Canyon City. Next up is just a little more in-depth look at the Giroux, Louis Adolphe Giroux and Marie Giroux. They had the Giroux Ranch, also known as Buffalo Peaks, also known as the McDowell Santa Maria Ranch, and it was owned by City of Aurora, and I understand they may have a residential library on this ranch. Well, Louis was born in France. He married Marie in 1849. She was 19 years old. A year later, they're here in America. They spend their first 10 years in New Orleans, Cincinnati, and even Kansas City. He was a wine importer. They arrive in Denver in 1860. He's a merchant in Hamilton, Colorado for 2 years. And then they take up the ranch at a small burg that we know as Garrow. And we understand that Marie had a hand in platting out that small community. He acquired some of the most valuable rights in the area, and that's why the ranch became prominent. He claimed South Park's first 2 permanent ditch rights for ag use. The first was to turn a wheel to churn butter, but the second was to drain a hay meadow. He operated a meat market in Denver and then a store in Fairplay. In 1868, the Rocky Mountain News lists Louis Giroux, Samuel Hartzell, Joseph Rogers, George Green, and others as the best-known South Park ranchers. Well, Louis dies at age 53. He and Marie had had 10 children. Not all of them were alive. She goes ahead and she builds up that ranch to 5,000 acres. Steers averaged 12 to 1,800 pounds each. She sold them for 4 cents a pound. She raised horses and shipped 2 carloads by train to Chicago. But the key is that she had the exclusive right to Trout Creek water for her ranch. Marie passes away in 1906, and it's estimated that the ranch was worth $200,000, perhaps the largest estate in Park County at that time. It's significant to know that in 1913, for the first time, the Department of Agriculture recognizes the important role that women played on farms and ranches. Next up is John Reeves, or also known as J.R. Witcher, up in Park County. Now, per Harry Epperson, and he wrote the book Colorado as I Saw It, it's often been quoted that a cowboy who hadn't worked for the 76 outfit wasn't a finished product. Harry never talked to any cow-minded man who hadn't put in his apprenticeship or his finale with that outfit. And Harry recalled the abundance of kindness that the 76 outfit had paid upon him when he had worked for them for a short time. Now, George Everett was born on his parents' ranch, 1890. Early on, he was given a calf, but by the age of 10, he had a few cattle. George liked everything about being a cowman. He loved to work, he loved to ride, and he loved to rope. And he participated in spring and fall roundups. George, during his lifetime, sold cattle for as high as $200 per head and as low as $18 all for the same type of cattle. He's the author of the Cattle Cavalcade in Central Colorado and also the Cavalcade of Trains in Central Colorado. But we're very thankful that he took the time to document the times, the people, what was going on during his time. Next up is Henry Beckham and Charles Beckham, Park County. Henry arrived here in the Colorado Territory from Missouri by ox train and he first settled at 3 Mile Springs, west of Canyon City. His mother, Eliza, dies in 1865, and his father remarries Emily Smart. She came from a well-respected Cherokee family. They had a son, Charles Thomas Beckham. Now, this is just pure gossip, but according to a family member, Charlie was sent to live with Henry because he was, quote, an Indian. He attended South Canyon City schools. Now, Henry came to have the Half Circle 6 Ranch, located northeast of Guffey. Paul Huntley recalled that Charlie Beckham, though, was one of the best ropers, and he rode with Dave Walker on trail drives from Eddy County, New Mexico, up here. Harry Epperson recalled seeing Henry Beckham involved in a historic faro game in Cripple Creek, year 1892. Now, faro players place bets on a special board, betting on a series of 2 cards as the dealer draws them. It's a fast-paced game. Dealers were highly respected, but it was an easy game to cheat at, so its popularity didn't last too long. Harry Epperson was 12 years old, and he was delivering newspapers in Cripple Creek. Harry was drawn into Johnny Nolan's saloon because there was a large crowd, a lot of commotion. Old bachelor cowman Henry Beckham was playing faro, and the dealer, Johnny Nolan, had lifted all the limits. The game went back and forth, and Henry Beckham played for 40 hours straight, while the house changed shifts every 8 hours. Beckham finally walked away with $2,000. Some of Henry Beckham's pallbearers were Mayor T. Lee Witcher, Tall Witcher, Frank Pigg, Ernest Stump, W.A. Stump, and Walter J. Black. And sources list Henry Beckham, along with other early prominent ranchmen, including John R. Witcher, that we just saw, John Bender on the Current Creek, the Eddy brothers over at Black Mountain, John Sweet, Freeman Waugh, that's Stirrup Ranch, William Gribble, Ira Mulock, I Am Ranch, William Stump, and W.J. Hammond, Current Creek. Next up is Charles Goodnight, and you'll see on the inside of your program we have some information about the chuck wagon. In 1866, Goodnight teamed up with Oliver Loving, and they formed a solid friendship. Goodnight built the first chuck wagon from an old Studebaker Army wagon. He and Loving and 18 cowhands hit the trail with 2,000 cattle. Next, we're going to present the Salt Works Ranch. It has had several owners, J.C. Fuller, Charles Hall, and Tom McQuaid, up in Park County. There are salt springs located about 20 miles south of Fairplay. They were known to the Ute Indians. The site acquired eventually the name Bayou Salada, meaning salt marsh. J.C. Fuller made the first attempt to produce salt from the springs for commercial sale. He ordered boilers, and he produced Pike's Peak salt. For some unexplained reason, he just quit. There's no explanation that we have found. Next up were Charles Hall and Mary Nye Hall. They had gotten married just before they acquired the property, but it's an interesting story about Charles Hall. He and 2 friends were prospecting in the San Juan Mountains, and they became lost. Charles struck out on his own, and he ended up in the area around Silverton. He only weighed 40 pounds. Mary Nye took him in. She had 2 children. Her husband had deserted her. But then they got married and they bought the Salt Works Ranch. Now, salt was in high demand. It was used for processing mineral ores, domestic and ag purposes. It was being shipped in by wagon from Missouri before the railroads arrived. It was in high demand, limited quantity, and the shipping cost made it awfully expensive. Well, Charles Hall and a couple of other investors decided to build a plant. It cost $60,000. The plant building had a 60-foot high chimney built by local Italian masons. One of them I know was from Salida. The building was 160 feet by 70 feet and 3 stories high. It had 18 evaporating kettles. They were 3 inches thick, they were 18 inches deep, and 40 inches across. The cost was $1,500 each for each kettle. They had been brought in by ox team from Missouri. The brine from the kettles ran into 2 pans. They were 11 by 28 feet. They were used for evaporation and separation. Now, this plant could hold up to 700 cords of wood for the furnace, and up to 1,000 pounds of salt could be stored in it. 6 to 14 men worked at the plant, and much of the salt went over to the Whale mine. Now, I think Charles had an interest in that. Salt also went over to Georgetown. The plant produced 760,000 pounds of salt while in operation. It was the only salt production facility ever built in Colorado, and it was the second manufacturing plant in Colorado. The first was a cannon factory. In 1869, the production stopped. There were a number of reasons, but primarily the brine was not as abundant or as strong as what they had hoped, and also the railroad costs went down. So, shipping it back in wasn't as much of a problem. The Salt Works Ranch, all during this time, was an operating cattle ranch. It was a stopping place for travelers. Charles Knocktree, that we talked about, had stayed overnight during a blizzard. And Judge Elias Dyer, son of Father Dyer, stopped at the ranch. Mrs. Hall was the proud owner of the first sewing machine in the area. And then we have Tom McQuaid. He was an up-and-coming rancher in his own right. He marries Mildred Hall Wessels, and they built up their holdings to 7 ranches. They owned/leased 20,000 acres of South Park's rich rangeland. They ran 10,000 head of cattle, and they were doing it under 14 different brands. Well, here's a fun fact about Ira Mulock. He looks kind of serious there, but he had an attraction for trouble. He thought he wasn't getting his fair share out of a community cooperative roundup, so he decided to set up his own. He bought a yellow circus wagon and a big top to use as the headquarters. He also brought in a bunch of mares for his cowboys to ride. Well, this just went too far. The cowboys were embarrassed by the circus aspect, and they definitely refused to ride the mares. They drove them off. So later on, I think Ira got the message, and he rejoined the cooperative roundup. Our next decade is 1870 to 79, and during this time, the railroad to Denver was completed. It was reported there were 6,000 head of cattle and 700 head of horses being raised around Fairplay. There was county-wide registration of brands. There was the Lake County War. Colorado became a state and the population exploded. This was the decade of the big buildup in Colorado ranching. Open range, growth of the cattle industry, profits for the rancher. This is, I thought, really interesting. Cattle increased from 291,000 in 1870 to 809,000 10 years later. Custer County was formed out of Fremont. And then there began to be statewide inspection to control losses from rustlings and strays. And Colorado was divided up into roundup districts with commissioners. So in this decade, we have Frank Rowe, who was the son of Alfred. They were on the Current Creek. And one of Frank's earliest memories was watching the first herds of longhorn cattle passing through the area. It's believed that it was the 3,000 herd of cattle that John Reeves Witcher had brought to the area. Now here's a poignant story about Thomas Morgan over back at Nathrop in Chaffee County. It was the fall of 1888, and Thomas Morgan decided that he would mortgage his homestead, and he went to Antonito to buy 1,000 head of longhorn steers. He drove them back up through the San Luis Valley to Nathrop, and he wanted those steers specifically because they grew faster and larger, he thought, than Hereford cattle. That winter there was a very severe snowstorm. All the steers crowded together in a fence corner. They either smothered or starved to death. He couldn't get the feed to them, the snow was so deep. He had no money to pay off the mortgage, and so he lost the homestead. 1915, he passes away in Nathrop, and he's buried in the Centerville Cemetery. Do y'all know where Centerville is? It's that little gasoline, rocks and mineral, gem strip, and right where the water pipes go over Highway 50 going up to Nathrop. And the Centerville Cemetery has a beautiful view up on top. It's on the right-hand side up above the Paquette Ranch. Next up is a couple of brothers that I found their story just to be fascinating. It's John Eddy and Charles Eddy. They owned the VVN Ranch, and that covered Park, Chaffee, and Fremont counties. Now, as we've said, the earliest ranchers claimed the best locations that had the excellent sources of water, hay meadows, and the potential to acquire immense grazing lands. The principle of first in time, first in right applied not only to irrigation, but to the rangeland. If land was already taken, a cattleman would move on, and therefore his range was always in relationship to that of his neighbor. The Eddys were from New York. Their father was involved in several different enterprises. He owned a tannery. He was one of the largest hops merchants in the area, and he was involved in banking. In the 1870s, their father went to New York City, and he incurred financial trouble. He lost almost all of his vast properties, and he died insolvent. Now, in the books and what we've learned, it hasn't been fully explained how this happened. Maybe if we'd had New York papers back here, maybe we would understand more. But due to the financial stress, the son, John and Charles, they went west to seek their fortunes. And they weren't the typical Easterners. They didn't come west, make their fortune, and then go back home. No, they thrived in the West. They learned how to ride, how to rope, and they learned all about the opportunities that the West had to invest their monies in. They first formed a partnership with a neighbor, George and Amos Bissell. They established the Eddy Bissell Cattle Company, and then they established the High and Lonesome Ranch in South Park. The Eddy brothers kept a journal, and it's held by the Denver Public Library. In it, it says that they had $7,000 in seed money and, quote, as much more as we need subject to our own draft. The Eddy brothers brought in 3 or more herds from Eddy County, New Mexico. The herds ranged from 1,800 to 4,000 head. Now, the High and Lonesome Ranch at Black Mountain only had 8 preempted acres. It had access, though, to 1,000 acres of government range land. Now, back then, a rancher could fence in 3 sides of an open space. They couldn't totally enclose it. But Black Mountain served as a natural barricade on the 4th side. In 1882, Paul Huntley is quoting Dave Walker as saying, "Walker said the second year he came up with a herd, he got here in late June, and he spent the rest of the summer cutting poles and logs to fence in 1,000 acres for a holding pasture. He said he was sure glad that he got this done, as he was only 18 years old." The first men to build corrals on the open range in that area were Edward Naylor, the Nichols family, and the Eddy brothers. Well, the High and Lonesome Ranch served as a summer camp. Winter quarters were a home and barn right near the Salida Golf Course. And there's also an Eddy Brothers housing addition in there, as time went on. They owned the Suckerville pasture near Whitehorn, that's way north Fremont County. Large pole corrals at Midway, that's up by Manitou Springs. And the cattle were shipped out of Salida to the eastern market. Their registered brand was VVN because a 3-letter brand is harder for a wrestler to change. They also established a ranch in New Mexico. It was called Halagueno, and it was near 7 Rivers, just outside of Carlsbad. Well, the Eddy brothers had a plan, kind of contrary to some of their neighbors. The New Mexico operation would produce an annual calf crop of 2- and 3-year-old cattle. They were strong enough to drive north. They were still young enough to be tender. They were small enough to pack on weight when they were fattened for market. And they were destined for 2 drives each year. The High and Lonesome Ranch up there at Black Mountain controlled the summer grazing. And the IM Ranch, which they eventually acquired the use of, gave them a place to hold cattle until better prices could be had. In 1883, there were 50,000 head of cattle, estimated 5,000 head of horses, and 10,000 sheep in South Park. It should be noted that also at this time, Arthur Murmod Jr. of the Stirrup Ranch joined the Eddy brothers in their New Mexico land and water ventures. Pat Garrett was a minority stockholder. In 1889, John Eddy was elected mayor of Salida, and Charles Eddy never married. 1893, the Eddy brothers shipped a trainload of steers from Salida to Kansas City, but it arrived there during the Panic of 1893. The big steers only brought $12 a head. That was a tremendous loss to their cattle operation, and that was the beginning of the end of their cattle business in Colorado. We've mentioned Dave Walker. This is one of the cattle drives that he's pictured in. In the early 1880s, he had brought up several herds from southeast New Mexico to South Park. He said there just wasn't enough water coming up from there to water more than 1,000 head. He told Paul Huntley the following. One spring he was up on a hill and he saw all around the country, and he saw 10 different herds ready to leave for Colorado. They would move up every few days, apart and spread out a little different to get the grass, but they could water at the same waters. It takes a lot of water for cattle, and they don't like muddy water any better than one of us. And they'll keep on moving to find a better place to drink. This is Thomas Ballman. He was the son also of Thomas Ballman. And the Ballman Hook Ranch is now known as the Trails End Ranch. If you take Highway 69 off of Highway 50 up towards West Cliff, and you've just passed Hillside, you'll see Trails End Ranch. On your right side is just beautiful country over there. T7 cattle were turned out on open range. That range was all the land east of Texas Creek to Grape Creek. The Arkansas River bounded it on the north, and the deeded land of the Wet Mountain Valley bounded it on the south. Roundups were held at Indian Springs Park, and that's between Indian Wells Road and the Copper Gulch Road. Cattle were of mixed breeds, some shorthorns, some Herefords. In 1896, Thomas Ballman married his sweetheart, Stella Hayden. She was the daughter of Lyman Hayden, and they were married at the Hayden Ranch near Hillside. They bought the Furnace Ranch, which was now in Custer County. It used to be in Fremont, and the headquarters for the present Trails End Ranch began. Our next decade is that we had the railroads arriving down Trout Creek Pass, headed for St. Elmo in Gunnison County. More silver was discovered in Silver Cliff. You began to have quarantines against sick cattle, and statewide brand registration was needed. The Midland Railroad established stations at Halbert, Spinney, and Hartselle. It became known as the Stockman's Railroad because it shipped large volumes of livestock from South Park along its system, served Buena Vista and Leadville, and it was discontinued back in 1918. But I also read that the cattlemen thought that the Midland Railroad took better care of their livestock. There were 226 cattle companies founded in Colorado, and the state experienced the largest cattle boom. We had English and Scottish investors amongst the most prolific in forming these cattle investment companies and buying ranch lands. Now, several of the large cattle companies went out of business after a severe winter, and out-of-work cowboys became homesteaders. Well, here's a fun fact about John Hysong. As I would read along, he would always be mentioned a sentence or two, and I always felt like he was kind of like the steady Eddie cowboy. He was just always there and dependable. Well, he came to Colorado when he was 16. He wanted to be a cowboy, and he got a job first with Ira Mulock on the I Am Ranch. In an article for the Canyon City Daily Record in 1934, he relates that the early years of the industry in Fremont County were prosperous, but in the 1880s, times got tough. Cattle grazed over the valleys and mountains without interference of farm or fence. It wasn't necessary to feed, and branding took place twice a year, and they had a big roundup that resulted from long cattle drives. Now, Paul Huntley describes John as, well, a bunch of men would be sitting down to eat, and John's mouth would be going full blast. But you know, he would have the best piece of meat on his plate before anybody else did. He never made a lot of money. He had more fun and was well liked by everybody. He lived to be 96 years old. This is the only photo that we have of Frank Failing. George Everett stated that just before World War I, Frank Failing, Frank Christopher, Bert Swain, and he himself, George Everett, served as the calf ropers in one of the biggest roundups in South Park. Now, not everyone got to rope calves. Each cowboy had a job to do, and only the best at roping would serve as calf ropers. The Cogan family arrived in Colorado from Ireland in 1880. Joe here, I think, has passed away in the last couple of years, but in a 2020 interview, he was asked about the greatest threats to agriculture. He believed them to be the impossible burger, inheritance tax. He believed ranches should be appraised on what they produced, and the influx of so many people. He had served on a search and rescue team. Next up is Arthur Mermod. This is Arthur Jr. here with his wife and the sister, Mary Fox, who was a sister of Charles Eddy. But Arthur Mermod Sr., 1887-88, was the owner and president of the Mohr Jacquard Jewelry Company in St. Louis, Missouri. It was one of the largest jewelry firms in the country. He had 2 sons, Arthur Jr. and Alex, and they had developed reputations for hard gambling, drinking, and womanizing. Their father wanted to break these sons of these bad habits, so he bought the stirrup ranch from Freeman and Edward Waugh for $78,000 for his 2 sons. While Arthur Jr. and Alex really missed their former lifestyle, and they began to convert the ranch headquarters into a gambling hall, complete with a roulette wheel, whiskey, and local girls. Well, the Cowboys would bet their monthly checks at the Mohr roulette wheel, so many of them worked for free. Well, over the years, the Mohr sold steers, but they consistently failed to show a profit. You kind of wonder why. Arthur Mohr, here, pictured back before there, thank you, became a partner of the Eddy brothers, and he was heavy into speculating in land and real estate in New Mexico. His wife and Charles Eddy's sister, Mary Fox, would host guests from Chicago at the Halagüeño Ranch. And you know, the Eddy brothers didn't just get people from Chicago. They got up there from the Broadmoor Hotel, and they were hobnobbing with them up there too. And Pat Garrett would drive them from the train depot out to the ranch. In 1899, the Mohr Stirrup Ranch was still appearing, mentioning of them in local newspapers. Now, Arthur Sr., it's said, has spent $155,000 purchasing and improving that stirrup ranch. But eventually, it's said that he sold it for $16,000 to Wharton Pig around 1900. The Smith-Frisky Ranch has always been called that. It was actually 2 properties. Andrew Smith was a miner and a rancher, and he sold his ranch to Gus Frisky in 1900. But Gus's father, Charlie, had died in 1880 of typhoid fever soon after the family had arrived in Chaffee County. And in 1881, Sophia and her sons were shown a ranch at the base of Mount Princeton by a Mr. McLean. And I think it's surprising that this name, Mr. McLean, has come all the way through history, and you still find it in the books. Well, he told them that the town of Buena Vista would be out to the ranch by 1890. And we all know it hasn't even reached out there yet. Sophia took up 160 acres, and historian Susie Kelly over there says that actually Sophia traded for the ranch. Son Otto took up 160 acres through the Homestead Act. Now, Sophia was known to be a good nurse. She sold pills, vitamins, and herbs from Granite all the way down to Buena Vista. She would pick wild strawberries at the ranch, and she would walk all the way to Buena Vista to sell them. Now, her son Otto ran away to sea at age 12. He was thrown overboard by the captain because he didn't obey orders quickly enough. The ship turned around, picked him up, but he gave up his life at sea. Now, Gus always was engaged in prospecting mining. I think that's really where his true passion lay. He worked at the Mary Murphy mine at St. Elmo. I read that he went down to Mexico, even up to the Dakotas, but it never seemed like he made a whole lot of money or anything. So eventually he decided he'd come back home and engage in ranching. Now, Frank Christopher was one of the owners of the Stirrup Ranch, but it should be noted that he built it up into one of the best and biggest ranches in Fremont County. Frank could do more work than any 2 men ever did. He would get up at 3 in the morning in the summertime, 4 in the morning in the wintertime. He could feed 400 head of cattle by noon and then ride all afternoon. He would ride in a lope, and if he was going any great distance, he he would take an extra horse with him. He'd ride the first one about 10 miles, and then get on the second one, turn the first one loose to go back to the barn. Frank would ride the other horse the whole rest of the day. Well, Paul Huntley knew him well, and he told Paul he never did get tired, and Paul believed him. His wife was a worker too. She would spend hours out in the blacksmith shop straightening nails and staples to use over again. Our last decade is 1890 and forward. We had the establishment of the forest reserves, you had severe winters, you had economic depression, low cattle prices, cattlemen were increasingly feeding their livestock, and Herefords began to dominate the industry. In 1902, the open range was still extending from Canyon City to Fairplay. Some herds were as large as 1 to 5,000. 1906 was the first Western stock show. Samuel Hartzell sells his land and cattle to the South Park Land and Livestock Company. 1913, the year my mother was born, severe winter forced some cattlemen out of business. World War I kept cattle prices high, and the nation's demand for beef led to the development of better breeds. 1919 was the peak year in that decade for cattle production. But in 20 to 22, you had a tumble in grain prices and land prices and also cattle prices. Eat more lamb was the slogan of Park County, and that area became one of the leading areas for wool and mutton producing. Of course, as you know, the 1930s, you had nationwide economic depression and extreme weather conditions. The Chess Ranch is a story of sadness and success. It's a Colorado Centennial ranch. The Chess Ranch was homesteaded in 1898 by Grant Chess, and he met an untimely death in 1904. He was patrolling the lines for the Public Service Company. There was a power pole at a key point. It was raining hard. There had been lots of rain and flooding. That power pole provided electricity up to Cripple Creek and Victor, and Grant was asked to go and check on it. The company was concerned with all the rain and the flooding. He drowned while performing his duties. His horse was found covered in mud, along with Grant's yellow slicker. The family came to an agreement with the Public Service Company. The older two boys would work for that same Public Service Company, patrolling the same lines that their father did between Canyon City and Victor. They alternated as to who would work and who would go to school. Eventually, Clyde, the youngest son, took over active management of the ranch. About Paul Huntley, that's such a sweet picture. He never knew his father, and at a very, very young age, we're talking, 5, 4, he was farmed out to L.D. Goss. He was a miner, a cowboy. I kind of interpreted him as being maybe a jack of all trades. Times were very tough. Paul ran barefoot everywhere. There was cacti everywhere. How close was he to home where he could pull out the cacti thorns? He and L.D. Goss were often just tenting. And at age 14, as we said, Paul started working for John Murray, the Parkdale rancher. He received $15 a month, room and board. At the Murray Ranch, you just kept your head down and you did whatever you were told to do. Debbie and I have been having a presence at the Coaldale Farmers Market. We're there to answer questions about the area. Our board is taking turns serving there. We sell our publications. But a lady came by and told us that she and her husband had known Paul Huntley, and she remembered him well. She and her husband had had a young child who had had a medical emergency, and he had to be life-flighted to Denver Children's Hospital, and his medical bills were enormous. Paul was attending the Cotopaxi Church, and the church had just raised enough money to replace the old pews that were there. Well, Paul one Sunday got up and he told the congregation that his old bones had sat in those pews for a long time, and he thought he could manage with the old pews for some more time. And he asked the congregation to apply the money that they had collected for the pews to the medical bills of the young child and to help out the parents. They did, and that couple never forgot the kindness of Paul Huntley. Paul is the author of several books. You may have heard of them: Black Mountain Cowboys, 100 Years on the Switzer Ranch, A Cowboy and His Horses, or Fremont County Ranchers and Cowboys. We owe a great deal of indebtedness to him and to Laura, who helped him with those books. Without them, we wouldn't know nearly as much about the area, the people of the area, the strong spirits that they had. Next up is a face that's near and dear to me. We know his son, Edgar Zabriskie. Ray, Edgar's father, was born in 1903 to William and Molly Zabriskie on their ranch. He basically grew up in the saddle. He was in close touch with every phase of the cattle business from early childhood, and children back then grew up quickly. When Ray was around 10, 11 years old, his father sent him on a mission, and I've heard that maybe T. Witcher was in on this too. They were sending Ray down to Sonora, Mexico, to bring back a trainload of wild-colored yearling steers. It'd be a week-long job. William taught Ray here 8 times every number because the steers were going to cost $8 a piece. Ray had a check in his pocket to pay for them. The Mexican cowboys helped him round up the steers and get them to the loading yards. But Ray was responsible at that young age for feeding and watering the animals at designated stops along the way back to Colorado. This is a picture of Ray with his horse Smokey. One day, both of them were struck by lightning. They both survived. But ever after that, Smokey wouldn't let Ray bridle him. He must have thought Ray had really done something to him. So his son Edgar, when he had to be bridled, had to do it. Now we're almost through. But Bill McKenzie was known to be very good at helping younger men get a start on their ranches. He himself at one time owned the Stirrup Ranch, part of the Beckwith Ranch that ran several thousand head of cattle in the open range days. He was ranked by many as being #1 ranchman in livestock holdings. He recalled how early cattlemen made money in Fremont County, but the next generation found the going tougher. Our last person is Denzel Goodwin. He's the little boy on the front of your program. His father was a pioneer rancher who had homesteaded in 1915 in Baca County. Denzel was born in 1924 to State and Lillian Goodwin. His grandfather, Dave Goodwin, had ranched in Texas after the Civil War. And his grandmother, Goodwin, was a niece of Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy. Denzel grew up on the ranch, and he learned the business from his father. He attended the public schools of Baca County and then Colorado State University. He married Miss Alice Marquita Goodwin. He served in the U.S. Navy, and he was stationed overseas for 14 months. In 1946, Denzel acquired the property to be known as the Goodwin Ranch, located near Howard. He operated 2,000 deeded acres and 15,000 leased acres. He ran Hereford cattle, with registered bulls, and his brand was the Open A/V. Now, the ranch dates back to 1870 when it was homesteaded and was known as the Alexander Place. And that's a family photo up there with a son and his wife. Are there any questions, comments? Because that's the end. The end. I promise, the end. We invite you to go back, take a look at our binders that we have back there, our cowboy display. There's also part of a display over here with Paul Huntley's saddle. Yes, ma'am.
I'm interested in knowing, what are you going to do with those binders? Where are they going to be that someone might be able to access them and really study?
We'll have them at our History Center. We also have given a set to our noted historian, Betsy Denny, who's sitting right behind you. And this is just really the tip of the iceberg. As we read more, as we begin to recognize family names more, we're adding names to those binders. As Debbie said, we want to develop a map because, like Paul Huntley in his book, he'll describe exactly where some ranch is. But unless you're a native and of that particular area, we're a little lost. So we have the homestead plats. We hope to locate them on a map. Instead of a really huge map, I foresee kind of a sectional map that, let's say the current Creek, we'll kind of note the ranches along there so visually you know where they are. That was our question, is we have all these people, where were they? And you know, the ranchers in Tallahassee Valley and that area, they just don't write much about those guys. And so when we find something, it's exciting, and then you want to know where it is. Yes, sir.
I saw a movie recently, Kevin Costner is in it, and these two guys are called free-range cattlemen. They have no land of their own, they have no headquarters, but they continually drive a herd over free range. And
right.
They're hated by regular ranchers and all that. Is there any evidence that they were happening around here?
The Lake County War, they say, was as a result of lack of resources, lack of land, lack of water, more settlers coming in. We have led a tour, Betsy has led a tour up to Nestorville, which is north of Cotopaxi off of County Road 12. And they were called nesters, and maybe if not in that movie, but in another one, they were calling the homesteaders nesters. So you do get some animosity. With wrestling especially too, they were quick to judge and quick not to ask questions. So you do see some of that. One of the things that surprised me is that with the sheep industry up there in South Park, I didn't read about any conflict. There was one where they were concerned that these sheep were going to be turned out, and a cattlemen's association kind of voted, well, they can't graze here, they can't graze there, and there was a whole list of places where they couldn't graze. But they kind of felt like some of those sheep had been brought in just kind of on spur of the moment, but you never saw any uprising about it, any hard feelings or anything like that. Never read anything like that. Any others? Yes?
You mentioned Johnny Nolan built that Carolyn.
Yes.
Wasn't he a rancher in the Cook Creek area?
Well, I'll take that suggestion, write the name down, and we'll start researching him.
That's a pretty familiar name for that Cook Creek area.
I don't doubt it, and I think there are so many more. We do have a partial list of Park County brands that we want to look through those names, see if we can't add some more people. Now, as Debbie mentioned, the average farmer rancher had 125 to 175 head of cattle. That could include almost everybody, had some cattle. So, I don't think we have the resources to look up everyone, But certainly, we have a lot more to do, and especially up there in Park County. You know, we first thought Fremont County, but then we began to realize all these ranchers knew everybody, and all their cattle mingled together, and they came all the way down into Chaffee County. So we had to extend our sites and include other counties, and you're absolutely right. We'll take that name, you know, as a suggestion. Anything else? Well, thank you all so very much for being attentive and coming today. Thank you. Okay, I think.